I believe that there is an understanding that peacekeeping makes a difference and is relevant not only, of course, to protecting population, but also to global peace and security.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. There are nearly 70,000 UN peacekeeping personnel serving in 11 missions around the world. My guest today, Jean-Pierre Lacroix, is in charge of them all. He has served as the United Nations Undersecretary General for Peace Operations for the last 8 years, giving him deep visibility into the unique role that UN peacekeeping plays in maintaining international peace and security. In our conversation, he describes the work of UN peacekeeping in places like Cyprus, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Lebanon, and more broadly, the work that UN peacekeepers do to prevent conflict and protect civilians. However, today, UN peacekeeping faces profound financial strain. While the United States contributes very few personnel to peacekeeping, it has historically provided about 25% of the cost of these missions. But the Trump administration is now seeking to eliminate American financial contributions to UN peacekeeping, and in our conversation, Undersecretary General Lacroix explains how he is preparing for potential cuts and what impact such a massive budget shortfall would have on the operations of peacekeeping around the world. This is a pivotal moment for UN peacekeeping, and Jean-Pierre Lacroix explains what is at stake in terms of the ability of Blue Helmets to protect civilians in conflict and prevent crises from spilling out of control. This conversation is a really unique opportunity to hear directly from a very senior official at the United Nations as the UN is undergoing some major changes owing to a financial and liquidity crisis. And I think Jean-Pierre Lacroix does a good job of explaining what is at stake for UN peacekeeping right now. As always, please feel free to reach out to me using the contact button on globaldispatches.org. I produce this show week in, week out for you. So if there's something on your mind that you wanted to share with me, if you have recommendations of people I should interview or topics I should cover, I really do appreciate hearing from you. So go to globaldispatches.org, hit that contact button, and get in touch. And while you're there, of course, you can subscribe to our newsletter. And most importantly, you can take the step from becoming a passive listener to an active supporter of this show by getting a paid subscription. Thank you. Now, here is my conversation with Undersecretary General for Peace Operations, Jean-Pierre Lacroix. So, Mr. Undersecretary General, thank you so much for joining me today. I just wanted to kick off with a very direct question to you. Why does UN peacekeeping matter in the world today?
When I go to the field and when I meet with the population who directly benefits from peacekeeping, I can tell that it does matter. Certainly it does matter to you. And I never heard anyone from these populations asking us to leave. They're usually asking us to do is to do more. And that goes a long way in showing that it does matter, certainly in terms of protecting civilians. And today, there are hundreds of thousands of civilians that are protected every day by our peacekeepers, civilian, the military, the police, working with humanitarian actors. Of course, we would want to do more, but so many civilians are protected, and sometimes peacekeepers really make the difference between life and death. Visited a number of internally displaced camps in South Sudan or northeastern province of Ituri in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And some of these camps are very big, with tens of thousands of people protected in a very hostile environment. And you can tell that if the peacekeepers were not there, then those people would be in very serious danger. So that's one thing. Now, the other thing where the added value is absolutely critical is the role of peacekeeping operations, many of them, in preventing the collapse of ceasefire. And the way it works is, if you look at Cyprus, for example, you have ceasefire there, you have two parties who do not recognize each other and who really barely speak to one another. I mean, the leaders speak in the context of the political efforts, but otherwise they just don't speak to each other. And yet, on that ceasefire line in the so-called buffer zone, there are many incidents that occur every week, sometimes every day, which could raise tension, create misunderstanding between the parties, and inadvertently lead to escalation. And here, the role of the peacekeepers is fundamental, because they are the only one who could speak to both parties, and they are the only one really who could liaise and basically de-escalate. Now, these are really some of the key areas where you have the added value of peacekeeping. But I would also add that in some cases, we really feel that we are making progress towards building state capacities and essentially empowering a nation, a government, to ultimately assert its control throughout the territory. And one example is the Central African Republic. We know there still is a lot to do in that country, but if we look at the progress that we made in supporting the reestablishment of the government presence, the police, the justice, the government officials in the various regions of a country, and also the reduction in violence with so many armed groups joining a peace process, a peace agreement, then that gives us hope that at some point, we might transition out of the Central African Republic and leave behind a country that is stable, which is something that happened in many other countries around the world, because the list of countries that were supported successfully by peacekeeping operation in returning to stability is very long, from Cambodia to East Timor to Sierra Leone to Cote d'Ivoire to Mozambique, Angola, and so many other. So, in a few words, what I believe is the added value of peacekeeping. And when we look at that, I think it's important to ask ourselves the question, what would happen if those operations were not there? What would be the consequences for not only the population concerned, but for regional and international peace and security?
I mean, as you are meeting with world leaders, today, and I know you've been in the position a long time. I mean, it seems in the world we're living in today, arguments about human security, about, civilian protection are, at least in my view, unfortunately less resonant today than they were in times past. And that world leaders today, particularly in the West, are focused more on like the hard security implications or the geopolitical implications of global security, of UN peacekeeping. Do those arguments resonate? And what arguments do you make to world leaders when do you want to convey the geopolitical benefits that are conferred by UN peacekeeping?
First of all, I would say that peacekeeping operations have a very strong platform of support across the international community and across governments. And we saw that recently in Berlin. There was a ministerial level meeting on peacekeeping, which was convened by the German government. Actually, that was really the first major international event after the new government started in Germany. And the expressions of support to peacekeeping were very strong and really coming from all continents. So that is, of course, encouraging to us. But most importantly, what that reflects is that I believe that there is an understanding that peacekeeping makes a difference and is relevant, not only, of course, to protecting population, but also to global peace and security. I think that protecting civilians, protecting population in itself is a way of preventing more disruption of international peace and security. So the connection is very much there. But in addition to that, reducing violence, making sure that whenever peacekeeping are present, it means that there is no security vacuum or we minimize security vacuum is also critically important to regional and global peace and security, especially if you look at the challenges that we are increasingly facing in those missions environment. The increasing role of transnational criminal activities such as trafficking in human beings, weapons, the resources that flow from these illegal activities and are fueling armed groups, terrorist groups. And all of this is becoming one of the most important challenges that we're facing, and frankly, one of the most important challenges to peace and security. Now, I think one important added value of peacekeeping is that through our presence, we mitigate and minimize the potential for these drivers of conflict to have an increasingly strong influence in disrupting peace and security. Now, I'm not saying that peacekeeping alone can effectively address these drivers of conflict. I think those really require a much more committed and stronger international mobilization. But I do believe that by avoiding security vacuums where they are deployed and peacekeepers contribute to sort of reducing the impact and the disrupting potential of these phenomena.
I wanted to ask you about a few missions in particular, and let's start with UNIFIL, the mission in southern Lebanon. We're speaking Monday, June 9th. There were reports today in the Israeli media that the United States may block the renewal of the mandate of UNIFIL when it comes up for vote in the Security Council in September. Now, I'm not going to ask you to comment on like rumors in Israeli media, but I do want to have you explain the role of UNIFIL today. And just to give listeners some context, Israel in October of last year launched a ground invasion of southern Lebanon in the very area where UNIFIL operates, attacking some UNIFIL positions in the process. There was a ceasefire that was agreed in late November. What has been the role of UNIFIL in southern Lebanon since that ceasefire?
I think it's important to recall that the legal platform on which UNIFIL operates is Resolution 1701 from the Security Council.
That was from 2006, I believe.
That's right. And the main goals of that resolution is to essentially reach a situation where the Lebanese authorities and the Lebanese armed forces would be in full control of all Lebanese territory with no other actors holding weapons, and that the security concerns of both Lebanon and Israel will be then addressed. I mean, that is really what the goal of Resolution 1701 is in plain speech. Now, UNIFIL is deployed and is essentially its role is to support that process. And you would understand that it requires both the active commitment and political will from Lebanon and from Israel so that, this process can be materialized, can happen on the ground. Now, since the end of the hostilities, UNIFIL has been very active in different ways. First of all, in supporting the Lebanese armed forces in their efforts to redeploy throughout the southern region of Lebanon, and there's been a lot of progress on that front. Second, Lebanese armed forces have been supported by UNIFIL in identifying and destroying weapons, several caches that were found in the region. UNIFIL is also very active in de-conflicting between the Lebanese armed forces and the Israeli Defense Forces. The Israeli Defense Forces are still present in Lebanese territory in 5 positions and a few buffer zones, so that deconfliction role is very important. And on top of that, UNIFIL also plays a very important role in supporting rebuilding and reconstruction efforts in southern Lebanon. That it's not its main role as per its mandate, but UNIFIL plays an important role in helping to clear mines, unexploded explosive ordnance, clearing roads, and all that can really help in supporting both the Lebanese armed forces, but also the population in the south to return to their home and start the rebuilding process.
Let me ask you then. I mean, you've described many various discrete ways in which UNIFIL is seemingly making a difference on the ground in southern Lebanon. If indeed the mission dissolves, if the mandate is not renewed, how do you suspect that would impact or shape the security landscape in southern Lebanon over the coming year, say?
Well, I think that there still is a need for a neutral UN presence on the ground, both because of the various activities that I mentioned, but also because, the situation in the region is not stable. The relation between Lebanon and Israel are still complex and not really appeased. That is a diplomatic understatement. I mean, we've seen regular strikes by the Israeli Defense Forces in Lebanese territories over the last couple of weeks. There are also incidents that continue to affect UNIFIL, both from the IDF as well as from the other side as well. I believe Hezbollah affiliated groups. And I believe that UNIFIL's ultimately would have to sort of gradually redeploy and leave Lebanon. That is the objective, of course, but that has to happen along a process that would see the progress in the implementation of Resolution 1701. Resolution 1701 is not yet fully implemented. The Lebanese armed forces still need to continue their process of fully deploying in the south. This is also an army that needs more international support because their capacities remain limited, and the support that is provided to them, both practical and operational, by UNIFIL is important. And I believe, again, that as long as you have IDF present in Lebanese territory, that deconfliction role is critically important. If you remove all this, then you would probably end up with a situation where the prospect of progress in implementing Resolution 1701 would be undermined. And you would also end up with a situation where the potential for more tension would be higher.
I wanted to also ask you about South Sudan, not a country that gets a whole lot of attention, at least in the Western media, but it is perpetually politically unstable. And earlier this year, it seemed as if it was on the brink of the re-outbreak of a civil war. There's been a large UN peacekeeping presence in South Sudan for many years now. What can the mission in South Sudan do to prevent a potential outbreak of civil war there?
Well, I think there are several levels. One is the level of political efforts, and the UN, our head of mission, has been working very, very actively with the African Union and with the sub-regional organization IGAD to support de-escalation and essentially a return to the implementation of peace agreement. There is still a lot of work to do, but those diplomatic efforts are very important and they need to continue, and they need to be more strongly supported by the international community, because you're right that the situation in South Sudan does not really make the headlines, and yet it is very, very concerning. So that's the first level. The second level is protecting civilians. That's really very high on the priority task of that mission.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth reminding maybe listeners, like 10 years ago in the height of the civil war, hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese civilians flocked to UN bases to seek a modicum of protection. And that just became the main mission of the peacekeeping mission in South Sudan.
That's right. And today, I mean, the connection between protecting civilians and reducing the risk of additional violence is very strong. I think it should be minimized. Now, our mission, UNMISS, has quite a significant footprint. It's also very agile. So it is able, when tensions arise in a given location, to deploy quickly and to mitigate, reduce the risk of escalation. And I mean, it's something that they do almost day in, day out. It's unsung. There's not much visibility, but I think that has contributed to minimizing this worrying trend of heightened violence in South Sudan. Ultimately, if the political process doesn't move forward, if there is no perspective of progress on the political front, then it is true that the risk of more violence is very much there. So our role is both to do everything possible to create a new momentum in the political process, and at the same time mitigating violence wherever possible and protecting civilians.
So I wanted to have you go through a couple of those examples just to give listeners a sense of the diversity of activities of UN peacekeeping. And I do so understanding that we're operating in this context in which the White House is seeking to eliminate American financial contributions to UN peacekeeping. In my view, it's part of a larger kind of slash and burn approach to foreign affairs spending adopted by the Trump administration. But the fact is, it is not an unrealistic outcome to expect that the United States, which historically contributes about 25% of the funding of all UN peacekeeping missions, may fund $0 in the coming year. That is like a potential contingency. So I'm interested in learning from you, how are you preparing for that potential outcome, for a potentially really major funding cut?
The UN, and that includes peacekeeping, has been already under quite a strong financial constraints, including a liquidity crisis, which has already led us to adopt a number of measures to sort of save cash. So that is not something that is totally new to us. And by the way, I strongly believe that it is our responsibility to do our best to be as cost effective as possible. So the quest for efficiencies, for saving money, for doing what we are mandated to do in the most cost effective way is, I believe, a responsibility that we've always accepted. And there's been a lot of effort in that direction, but we certainly need to do more. At the same time, what we expect from member states is consistency. In other words, on the one hand, we have mandates given by the Security Council, and it's legitimate for us to expect adequate resources for the purpose of implementing these mandates. Now, there is a lot that could be said about mandates. Some people say they are sometimes too broad. They are like Christmas tree. They should be prioritized. We do accept this. Actually, we have been advocating for quite some time for a better prioritization of tasks in the Security Council mandates that are given to peacekeeping operation. We've been working a lot to elicit efficiencies. One example is how we use our air assets, which is an important budget group, and how we've been able to save a lot of money in terms of how we use those assets. But we need to have adequate resources. Now, we don't know exactly what will be the situation, in the next budget cycle, which, as you know, for UN peacekeeping is from July to June. We may not receive all the payments from member states that are provided for in the budget. And yes, we do contingency planning just to make sure that if that happens, then our peacekeeping mission will not default and will be able to continue implementing their mandate, albeit, of course, on a reduced scale if we don't get the money.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you. Like, what does that reduced scale actually look like? I mean, you talk about cost savings, and I appreciate that, but UN peacekeeping is potentially facing like a quarter of its budget slashed. That's seemingly not something that you can mitigate through minor cost saving measures. So, looking forward, how do you continue to operate, or what do you cut? Surely you can't operate at the same levels. And so, how do you do either the same with less? How do you do less with less?
We would be doing less with less. We're absolutely preparing for a situation where we would have that significant, potentially minus 25% liquidity. And yes, we're preparing for that. And obviously, that would involve very substantial cuts in pretty much all budget groups, in pretty much all components of peacekeeping operation, be it the military, the civilian, the police, the operational cost, the staff cost, everything. Yeah, that's what we're preparing for. But at the same time, we hope that we won't have to implement those plans. And we will continue strongly advocate for peacekeeping mission to be adequately resourced, consistent with the mandates that are given to them. And as a UN activity, peacekeeping has a very high level of support across member states. And we also count on all those member states to support us in this advocacy.
Well, if I could just maybe keep pressing you on this. I mean, we talked about South Sudan earlier. I'm curious also your perspective on the mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo, another, hot conflict zone. How does UN peacekeeping manage with 25% of its budget cut potentially in areas like, say, the DRC or South Sudan? Like, what are you cutting? What are you doing less of?
I mean, we're currently reviewing with our mission, where those cuts could be sort of happening, without undermining the key priority task of the mission. I mean, clearly, with minus 25%, they would have to do less with less. And that is why we're planning, that is why we do contingency planning, to make sure that if we have to get there, then the reduction would be effectuated in a planned and strategic way rather than just cutting across in some sort of linear fashion, without taking into account the key priorities. I mean, we have in South Sudan, as well as in the DR Congo and in other mission setting as well, we have areas where the tensions, the violence, the potential for threats for population are higher than in other places. We have various tasks that are mandated by Security Council, and if we have those reduction, then we have to prioritize. What is it that we absolutely need to focus on? What is it that, given the shortage of liquidity, we should deprioritize? I mean, this is really what we have to do. But clearly, with less 20-25% cash, then all components of peacekeeping operation would be affected, and we're preparing for that. And at the same time, we have to make sure that the missions will be able to continue throughout the budget cycle, that is, again, July to June next year, without having to just basically suspend everything they're doing, because then, the impact for peace and security, for peace efforts for the population in those countries where peacekeeping missions are deployed would be very, very severe. And I believe the impact on peace and security across the globe would be very, very negative.
Looking to the future, I mean, if we were to speak a year from now, where do you expect UN peacekeeping to be?
Well, I think that we have a couple of exercises that are currently ongoing where basically, we're looking at what the future of peacekeeping and broadly also peace operation, all field presence of the UN in the area of peace and security. And of course, the future is uncertain. I mean, we talk about the liquidity crisis, the uncertainty in terms of payment by member state, all this. But if we look at the key challenges that we're facing, number one is the political challenge. Member states need to understand that peacekeeping operations are political. All of them are created to support a political process, political efforts towards durable peace. And those processes need a stronger, more united, and more committed effort by the international community. That's number one. It's aspirational, I understand that, but it's very important to get that message across. Number two, we need to look at how we can work in a more effective way. And here there are a number of opportunities. First, I think that the issue of prioritizing mandates is becoming increasingly acknowledged and understood as an important issue. We cannot do everything. Those Christmas tree mandates are just too ambitious. They don't come with adequate resources. So we need to have those more prioritized mandates, and it's a responsibility of the Security Council. It's a responsibility of our member states. Number three, we need to take advantage of the evolving tools that we have, the digital technology, to do the same things that we're currently doing, but with more cost effectiveness. And here I believe that there are tremendous opportunities to achieve that. But I think that if we look at the bigger picture, how do we address more effectively the drivers of conflict that I mentioned, transnational criminal activities and their impact on conflict, the impact of climate change, the impact of global terrorism? It's not only a peacekeeping effort, it has to be a global UN effort and a global multilateral effort. How do we make sure that peacekeeping is deployed where it makes sense, and where it doesn't make sense, where peace enforcement is required, not peacekeeping, then others who can do peace enforcement are better supported? I mean, so we have to look at all these issues. That's what we're currently doing. Actually, we are mandated by member states to look at that in the Pact for the Future that was adopted in last September by a member state, by the General Assembly. There is a request for us to look at the future of peace operation writ large, peacekeeping and other forms of UN operation in the area of peace and security. So that's what we're currently doing. But again, I think that the few key elements that I've mentioned to you are really important to sort of look at.
Mr. Undersecretary General, thank you so much for your time. We'll have to leave it there. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.